But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we unravel the threads of our shared past to understand the present and envision the future. Today we're setting sail on a voyage through time back to the age of discovery. In this episode, we're spotlighting a figure who has been a mainstay of textbooks, a man both celebrated and criticized, and who transformed the world in ways previously unimaginable: Christopher Columbus. Columbus, a Genoese explorer sailing under the Spanish flag, is often recognized for his 1492 voyage across the Atlantic, connecting the Old World with the New. This journey initiated an era of extensive European exploration and the eventual conquest of the Americas. However, history is rarely simple or straightforward, and Columbus's story is no exception. Throughout this podcast, we're going to traverse through the murky waters of historical perspectives, separating the myths from facts about his life, his journeys, and the profound impact he had on the indigenous communities he encountered. We'll explore these dramatic encounters, the conflicts, and the transformations ignited by Columbus's voyages, as well as the legacy that follows him into our modern world. So prepare yourself as we embark on a journey over 500 years back in time to revisit the life and times of Christopher Columbus during the Age of Discovery.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we'll be talking about Christopher Columbus, who, for our American listeners, will have probably heard about him a lot during, elementary school and high school days, learning a lot about history. And I think the most interesting piece that we found is, Christopher Columbus never discovered America, yet when we look at the United States, the word Columbia, it's all over the world, all over the United States, and it's so ingrained in kind of everything that we see, especially in America. And he's really had this almost revered state within the United States. But he has a very, very interesting story, and I think is really misunderstood in a lot of ways. We see today a lot of pushback around his treatment of indigenous people, to people saying he was so brave and a pioneer and an incredible explorer. And I think the answers is obviously, as we seem to find on this podcast, is a lot more nuanced than that. So Ritchie, I'm just curious, I think you probably had the same feeling as me coming into this, as we kind of put him in his box and we kind of thought we knew what we were getting. But I think this is way, way outside of that box. And there's a lot more different things that are happening with Columbus that I think the listeners are really going to find interesting as we kind of go through the episode today.
Yeah, I think if I've learned anything from doing this podcast with you, Paul, the devil is in the detail. The nuances is where those interesting kind of discussion points happen. It's, historically, when we have these discussions in school or with people, just broadly speaking, you don't often get the opportunity, unless you study history at a, university or post-academic level, which, I have some experience with. You never really get the full picture because you don't get to dive really deeply with that sense of depth and analysis to be able to kind of pinpoint and pick apart those nuances. And I think like a lot of our episodes, we go in with a certain perspective or mindset or kind of, a conclusion already kind of formed based on what we've known or heard before. And then sometimes we come out and we're like, okay, yeah, that totally, changed my perspective or kind of shifted it, at least to some degree. I don't think I've walked away from any episode really with the same mindset of any one historical decision or figure that we've looked at. Sometimes it was worse than I thought, and sometimes it was better than I thought. And with Columbus, I think, the whole Columbus Day thing, that kind of blew my mind. He never actually set foot in continental America. But again, he has a very interesting story and journey. It's much more than him just discovering, quote unquote, the New World. There's a person behind this story, and he's quite fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we talk about a lot of the people that we've looked at, and I think something I've seen a lot of is the people that have this grandiose kind of, I guess people look at them and revere them and say, this person's the best. Like we just talked about George Washington a few weeks ago. And we kind of looked into him and we were like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Joan of Arc was another one. I was like, Joan of Arc, what's so special about Joan of Arc? Why does everybody love her so much? And it kind of made sense. Columbus was a bit different, I think, in that sense. We see this, everyone kind of for the longest time saying Columbus, he's the best ever. But I think that has shifted a little bit in the mainstream. I think we've seen it go from Columbus is the greatest person ever to he's the worst person. And I think I was even doing my research. I saw a video that said it was like Columbus, the madman butcher of indigenous people and stuff. And it's kind of again, the answer is somewhere in the middle. So I think we'll get into Columbus himself. But I think first we need to kind of give the listeners an exploration a little bit of where the world is at this time, and specifically a few different pieces. So we're going to look into the exploration phase of the world as technology is developed, where boats are getting a lot more complex and can go a lot farther. Navigation has improved, where these long haul voyages can start to be conducted. But I think we need to start with the commercial slave trade that exists in Europe. So when we think of slavery in the traditional sense, the most common thing we think about is the transatlantic slave trade, where slaves were coming to the Americas, mostly to Brazil, but also to the Caribbean and into the United States. But even before that happens, there is a massive slave trade in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So a lot of major religions, specifically Christianity and Islam, had rules where you couldn't enslave someone of your own religion. So what that ended up creating was a lot of conquests into other lands, where they would take Muslims slaves or they would take Christian slaves back to wherever the invaders are coming from and use them as slaves because they're of a different religion. But the biggest place where a lot of slavery is happening is in the Slavic region of Eastern Europe. So when we think of that, think of like east of Germany, north of maybe Greece, kind of Czech Republic area. So a lot of Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian people are being sold into slavery. So there was a massive slave trade throughout the Middle Ages, coming from Eastern Europe into Western Europe, into North Africa, into the Ottoman Empire, into the different Muslim caliphates, even into the Byzantine Empire as well. And the reason they were allowed to become slaves is they were still pagan. So they were believing in their form of Slavic mythology, not into God and Christ or Allah and Muhammad. But what tends to happen over the years is Christianity and Islam start to spread into those areas, and that becomes makes those people become Christian or Muslim, therefore breaking that rule of you can't enslave your own people. Also, the Muslim raids are starting to move more into Europe to try to take a lot of Catholic and Christian slaves and bring them back into the Muslim world. So we had like the Barbary Coast, so all the North African countries really known for their slave trade. We have the Genoese, who are going to be character today. Christopher Columbus is actually born. So on the west coast of Italy, you have Genoa, and on the east coast, you have Venice. And they've created this huge slave trade empire that's coming through, bringing boats from Italy through up into Crimea and working with the Crimean kingdoms who are moving into those Slavic regions, bringing Russian people, Polish people down to the coast. And then the Genoese and the Venetians are spreading those slaves throughout Europe and into Africa, North Africa, and into the Middle East as well. To kind of bring that all together, one thing that I found interesting too is where the word slave even comes from. So slave actually derives from Slav. If the name of your people is being used for the term of slavery or slave, it just tells you how many slaves are actually coming from that area. So this entire, I guess, like slavery industrial complex, for a lack of a better word, has been coming up, where you have all of these slaves coming from the Slavic regions, but then also you have raids into Muslim and Christian territory, respectively. And you've created this vast slave network. And so slavery is very much a key piece of how all commerce is done in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa at this time. So I think it's important to remember, as Columbus and these other explorers move into Western Africa, move into the Caribbean, into the Americas, that this is not a new concept. They didn't just show up and say, hey, we should bring slaves here. And we'll get into some of those details in a bit, but I think it's an important piece to know that slavery is very, very much ingrained in pretty much everything that's going on in the world at this time.
I think that's a good point, Paul. I think just like doing more of the bio that we'll get into with Columbus, I kept kind of circling back to this idea of, people being a product of their times. And I think that's kind of one of those, angles or perspectives, which I think we need to keep in mind for this conversation and most of our conversations. Like these people, these historical figures, they made decisions, they acted in an ecosystem or an environment where the culture and social mores obviously had some sort of impact on how they operated in the world at their time. So I think that's a very important point moving forward.
Definitely. And I think we have to look at like what the expectation is for a lot of these people. There's a lot of money in slavery, and a lot of times money is the main reason most people are doing what they're doing. And we'll see that with Columbus as we get there. But before we get to Columbus, we need to go a little bit to the west of where Columbus is and go to Portugal. And so for Portugal's basically the most Western European country. So if we look at where Spain is, it's just to the west, and it kind of takes a sliver of the Atlantic coast. And at some point, the Portuguese are a very, very small kingdom, don't have a lot of power, but they make the conscious decision to start exploring out to the west and to the south. Being right on the Atlantic Ocean, it gives them the opportunity to not have to go across a lot of land. They don't have to go through any choke points in the Mediterranean. They have this huge coast that they can start to use. So in 1317, they made an agreement with a Genoese merchant sailor, basically appointing him the first admiral with trade privileges with his homeland in return for 20 warships and crews, which is the goal of defending the country against Muslim pirate raids, which basically laid the groundwork for the first Portuguese navy. So this is to go back to, why would he go to Genoa? Well, it was because they were some of the best sailors in the world. Like we were saying, they had this massive slave trade, and then they also had a huge just economic shipping commercial enterprise that they would ship things all over the Mediterranean, up to Britain, to the Byzantine Empire, all over the place. And so that kind of starts bringing the Portuguese into this exploratory kind of kingdom. And then the 1400s hit, and this is kind of the golden age of exploration for the Portuguese. So they start with going completely west of Portugal and just sailing into the Atlantic, and they find the Azores and Madeira. And those are two uninhabited islands in the Atlantic Ocean, which still belong to Portugal today, which they inhabit and use as basically small colonies where they can use as shipping stop-off points and doing a few other things. Then they start to explore down the west coast of Africa. They land in Senegal, they land in the Cape Verde. They also get down to the Gold Coast, which is like where Ghana is, and basically figure out that there's a ton of gold there. So what they do is they set up a trading post. And what kind of happens with the Portuguese is every year they start to go a little bit more south, a little bit more south, a little bit more south, with the ultimate goal of they're trying to find a way to get to India, because India was the biggest place for trade in the world. And there was so much commerce that was going on there. If you think of the world in a kind of a map, to get from Europe to India, you have to cross through the heart of Muslim territory. And as we kind of spoke about before, going through Muslim territory as a Christian is an easy way to become a slave based on the rules that were kind of set up. And there's a lot of animosity, bunch of crusades still going on, still lots of war between the Muslims and Christians. So finding a route by sea is a huge way to figure out how to get a lot of these goods back to Portugal and to Europe. So there's a huge economic piece to this. So they keep trying to find this route. They get to the Congo. They think, maybe there's a river that'll cross all the way across Africa. They find the Congo River, which they sail into the African heartland, but realize that eventually it ends and they can't get to Africa. So they keep going more south. And then eventually in 1488, they get to the Cape of Good Hope, which is the very southern tip of Africa, and realizing that there's a way to get to the Indian Ocean, which is actually a brand new concept. There was the thought that the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean weren't connected. They thought Africa basically went all the way down to the south, basically connecting with Antarctica, and there was no way to cross, but they've disproved this by going around South Africa. And then they eventually, over the years, find a way to get to India. They stop off in Madagascar and a bunch of places. And it's actually an interesting thing. They show up to India for the first time with all of these. They have like silks and different things that they're bringing from Western Europe. And the local Indian lord basically looks and laughs at them and said, I've been getting all this stuff from the Muslims for years. And like, this is almost embarrassing. Like, this is what you bring me. So it's just an interesting piece of, this is such a huge feat because they've done it by sea. But the Indians have been trading with Persia and the Muslim states, and basically said, like, we can send people to the markets in Mecca and get way better stuff. And we've been doing it for years. So I don't know what this gift is. Like, come back and try again. But I think it's just kind of a funny little story. And the last kind of big piece, though, of all of this is we've talked about Portugal hitting up all of these different places, is they don't really colonize any of these places. They stop, they create trading posts, and they just use them for trade. So we have like Goa in India, for example, is a big one. There's a lot of small trading posts set up around West Africa. They end up taking this one island off the west coast of Africa called Sao Tome, and that was uninhabited, and they basically used that as a trading post as well. They'd end up bringing slaves into that place later on, but basically to start off, it's all of these different trading posts, which is very different than what the Spanish will do. The Spanish are looking to take areas and then bring in Spanish settlers. And we see them do that throughout all of the Americas. And so I'll quickly go over what they did in the Canary Islands, because I think it's important to understand, because this is the first Spanish colonization attempt. So the Canary Islands are just off the west coast of Africa, kind of near Morocco, into the Atlantic Ocean. And this was the first, I would say, European colonization of a place that actually had indigenous people in it. That was like an island or something in the way we would kind of think about it. And so it takes them almost a whole century to take the Canary Islands. It's a lot of different wars with the indigenous population, but eventually they're able to win that war and take control of the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands didn't really have a huge population. Again, 100 years of war will do that. Plus, it's just not a very big place. But they find the climate is perfect for all of these cash crops. And so sugarcane is a huge, huge source of income for a lot of these European countries. And the Spanish realize that they can turn the Canary Islands essentially into this factory. So they start to go to slave traders in West Africa and bring African slaves into the Canary Islands to start working the fields. And it becomes very profitable for the Spanish crown. It was kind of became the blueprint of how these colonization attempts would work in the Caribbean and the Americas as well. So it really is important to understand that the Canary Islands were essentially a success story for the Spanish. It took a lot of effort and a lot of time to do that, but it's also in complete contrast of what the Portuguese were doing, because the Portuguese were going to places where there was a lot of resources, a lot of kingdoms already set up, and they were just trading and making a ton of money. So it's kind of two different sides of the same coin, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of money to be had in the exploration field, the colonization field, the setting up of trading posts. And that's kind of where I think Columbus almost comes onto the scene. But maybe, Ritchie, before we get to that, we should talk a little bit about Queen Isabella and Spain. So with Queen Isabella, we have to think of where the country of Spain is at this time. And Spain doesn't actually exist as a country as we know it today. There's two kingdoms. There's the Castile and Aragon. And so that's basically on the Iberian Peninsula. So we think of like where Spain is today on a map with Portugal in the west. That entire place is Iberia. And so what happens is Queen Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon get married and essentially create this royal union to unify their two kingdoms, to which basically becomes what we would consider Spain today. But if we go back about 800 years, we need to remember that the Iberian Peninsula was a completely Muslim area for the longest time. It was controlled by a group called the Moors, who originated from North Africa, and they were Muslim. And over the next 800 years, something called the Reconquista happened, which was essentially means reconquest, to take Iberia from the Muslims by Christians. So this would be Christians from France were coming in, different kingdoms were popping up. But at the time of Isabella and Ferdinand, pretty much most of the Iberian Peninsula has been taken back. But the area to the south called Grenada is still a Muslim province. And so they're trying to take that back to unify Spain as this Catholic country. So one thing with Isabella is she was known as Isabella the Catholic. So she was very, very religious and really had a one single mindset of this area everybody needs to be Christian. Everyone really needs to be Catholic. So a few different things happen. So like I said, they launch a campaign into Grenada, which they're able to take, but spend a lot of money doing so. They got what they wanted, but they're in debt, which we'll see why Columbus's voyage becomes so important as a part of that. They do the expulsion of all Jewish people from Spain. So there's about 100 to 200,000 living in the country. They either had to convert or they left. Nobody knows the exact numbers for sure, but it's in the hundreds of thousands that were needed to convert or leave. And then some left and some just converted. They also would start to gradually push the Muslim population out over the next century with the same sort of tactics. They also Isabella had this mindset of she wanted to, any area that she took, the people were her royal subjects, especially if they converted to Christianity. She almost was like a mother figure in a way.
Very interesting.
So she said something about when Columbus goes to America, and just her thought of this whole exploration piece is she was not in favor of slaving any American natives or indigenous people. She established the royal position on how the indigenous people should be treated by following the recent policy implemented in the Canary Islands, where she saw them as her subjects. These are her people. She doesn't want them enslaved. They would bring in slaves from Africa who weren't Christian because that's kind of the way it worked. But she stated that they were all subjects of the crown and could not be enslaved in most situations. There were circumstances where a person could be enslaved, like prisoner of war, for example, or practicing cannibalism. And so that's even funny. We'll see Columbus and the people moving to the New World, they seem to find a lot more cannibals than probably existed. And I think part of the reason is, well, this person's a cannibal, so all bets are off. So it's an important piece on just to understand where Columbus is getting his orders from and what Queen Isabella is thinking before we bring him onto the scene. But there's one last thing I wanted to bring up. And Ritchie, I was curious, did you read anything on Prester John by chance?
No, that name does not ring a bell. Prester John.
So this is something that's super interesting. He doesn't exist, but there was this legend for centuries about this man named Prester John, who is this Christian king who somehow got separated from Europe and was like almost behind enemy lines. So people would think maybe he's in Asia, maybe he's in Africa, maybe he's in this place across the Atlantic Ocean that we don't know. Mm-hmm. And basically they think that he's created this Christian kingdom and he's just waiting to be found. And when he's found, he's going to take his kingdom, he's going to merge with the Western Europeans, and they're going to destroy Islam. Like, that's kind of the thought. And so Columbus and a lot of these people are actually looking for this person. When Columbus goes west, he's asking, well, I wonder if this person is Prester John. Where's Prester John? And so a lot of people are starting to ask these questions, and obviously they never find him because he doesn't exist. And eventually they realize that this was kind of a fairy tale. But it's just interesting because I have written here is religion is everything in this story. And we need to really remember that is the obsession of crusades against Muslims, bringing Catholicism to the colonized people, making sure that the world is completely Christian or Catholic is basically the main goal of the Spanish. And even Ferdinand of Spain, he has this mindset, and he's almost had people tell him that you will take Jerusalem one day. You will be the one to destroy Islam forever. And so there's this, I don't even know, this fantasy of being the person to destroy Islam and bring Catholicism to the world. And so everything that's done up to this point is really, you can all roll it back to that devout Catholicism and love for God and Jesus and all that kind of stuff that comes with Christianity. So that's kind of where we're at. And a man from Genoa will make a very, very big appearance in this grander story.
It was very interesting, Paul, just kind of listening to some of the points you made, and a couple of things come to mind that I think might be worth just kind of calling out. One, the kind of blueprinting of Queen Isabella to treat the inhabitants of other colonies as royal subjects, has a very British Empire air to it, right? Yeah. Like, you're a part of the empire versus we are here to enslave and like, to your point about religion is everything and everything is religion up to a certain point in history. I think that also kind of goes back to another sentiment, I think that exists across all of our episodes thus far, this idea of the other. Right. Like it so much of history comes down to, well, they're different. Yeah. And that's kind of the basis of any kind of rationale for making a decision to conquer, colonize, or enslave. And we'll definitely have sentiments of this. We already do from your analysis, and we definitely do when we kind of do a deep dive into our friend Christopher Columbus. So I think, it's a good pivoting point to kind of see where Columbus fits into all of this. I think he did a great job of kind of, painting us a landscape of what's going on, across the broader world. And I know, like, we always talk about the age of this or the age of that, and it's always this kind of neat little way to talk about history. It's probably a marketing ploy in all honesty, but we really are talking about the quintessential age of exploration, or like the age of discovery. This period in the early 15th century to the early 17th century, during which Europeans are kind of exploring across Africa, America, Asia. They're trying to find new trade routes, the establishment of colonies, this kind of new extensive contact that's happening between hemispheres. Ultimately, it's going to have a profound effect, leading to cultural exchange and conquest and colonization and exploitation, things we've already touched on before. And here comes Christopher Columbus. He's the central figure in this age of exploration, born in the Republic of Genoa, which is modern day Italy. Italy doesn't exist at the time, kind of like your sentiment about Spain. It might somewhat of an idea, but there's nothing formally recognized as this kind of state called Italy. It's known pretty early that Columbus had a deep interest in navigation, exploration, and ultimately he believed, and we'll see how much he believed and how much he was unwavering in his belief, that he could find a quicker route to the lucrative markets of Asia by sailing west, bypassing the traditional overland and maritime routes, which were controlled by the Ottomans at the time. So we'll jump into his early life. So he's born in 1451 in Genoa, which is the Republic of Genoa. He's the eldest of 5 children. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a middle-class wool weaver who also ran a cheese stand. Young Christopher helped there as a worker. His mother was Susanna Fontarosa. So in the bustling city port of Genoa, Columbus, historians think, received a pretty modest education. He likely learned to, read and write in the local language. He learned some Latin, possibly some commercial skills, including some basic math, navigation, and cartography. However, I think it's safe for us to assume his formal education was probably quite limited. He didn't really come from the upper class, especially when you compare it to the other intellectual luminaries of the time. From an early age, historians kind of have this idea that he was like drawn to the sea. As a teenager, he took to the sea, starting his seafaring career probably on merchant ships, where he would have learned some really foundational navigational skills, and learned about the world beyond Europe. His early voyages took him to the Mediterranean, the Aegean seas, as well as such places as Chios and Aegean Island, and as perhaps as far as north of England and Iceland. I think it's also important to note, kind of just doubling down on your sentiment that you shared earlier, Paul, everything is kind of about religion at this point in time. Columbus was deeply religious, likely a trait he inherited from his mother's devout Catholicism. This kind of spiritual belief, it kind of underlies a lot of his thinking and rationale. And a lot of what I think personally, kind of doing some research about him, served as one of his key motivators for his voyages into the world. So his early experiences at sea and his exposure to stories from explorers and merchants, probably piqued his interest in exploration. He was reading works from Ptolemy. He read Marco Polo's travels, and, this idea of traveling and exploring and discovery is probably, catching social fire around the culture. And he's definitely inspired by these stories of these faraway places that, often will provide new riches. You never go to a faraway new place to not make money. And I think this is a sentiment that's, quite real here. So this inspired him to devise a plan to reach wealthy kingdoms of East Asia by sailing west, as he believed at the time that the Earth's circumference was much smaller than it was. So just a bit of a tangent here on flat Earth theory. So it's actually, most historians confidently believe that most people knew that the world was not flat. And they take that back to even 500 years previous to Columbus. And Columbus himself did not believe that the world was flat. So there is some myths out there that he believed that the Earth was indeed flat, but it's been known for quite some time, even predating Columbus, that the world is, global in nature and not flat.
It's funny you say that, because that was always one of the things I remember hearing growing up, was like Columbus. He was just so smart. Everyone thought the world was flat, but he knew. So he went out and they're like, "You're going to fall off the Earth. What are you doing?" It's like everybody kind of like, it makes sense. Like, how are they doing this complex navigation? Like the Portuguese going around Africa to get to India, if they don't have very, very complex knowledge of cartography and navigation and trying to use the stars and land points. And again, they've definitely figured that out. So that just makes total sense. But again, it's always funny how these myths just kind of permeate through time.
That's one of the things that I grew up hearing about him, that he was the only one that thought otherwise. Like, oh, what an innovator. But and in reality, it was the exact opposite. Everyone was kind of operating under the same assumption that the world was indeed not flat. So if we talk about his kind of early voyages before the famous ones that we'll get into, these are some very formative years which were crucial in shaping, him into a very ambitious explorer that would, again, kind of lay an additional foundation and build upon those early navigational skills and some global perspective that he would employ across his voyages in the Atlantic. So while the exact dates of his early voyages are kind of hard to pin down during his adolescence and young adulthood, they aren't very well documented. As his later, more famous expeditions that we'll get into, it is known that he gained considerable experience at sea during the time, which was crucial, for what was going to happen down the road. So when he did start going to sea, it was not unusual for boys of his time and place. So he began working on those merchant ships. He was transporting goods and passengers between various ports. They would have taken him to different locales, exposing him to cultures and fostering a global perspective. One specific voyage Columbus is known to have made early in his career took him to the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea in 1475. It was during this trip that he would learn the fundamentals of life, navigation, ship handling, the challenges of long sea voyages, which, we'll get to. These journeys likely kindled Columbus's interest in exploration and the world beyond Europe. Furthermore, it's believed that Columbus, if he did in fact sail as far as the British Isles and possibly of even Iceland, there's a good chance he might have heard some stories about a world not too far from where he was landed. So this kind of idea of storytelling and narrative and folklore, just kind of sparking and nurturing and kind of flourishing his imagination about what's possibly out there. It's kind of an interesting little nuance that I didn't necessarily consider prior to doing this, because we try to deal in a world of facts when we do historical analysis, but to think that hearing a story or folk tale might have been one of the crucial factors in pushing him to actually explore the New World, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we always forget, right? The Vikings were in Newfoundland and in Canada and Greenland and Iceland well before any of these voyages happened. And so you're right, there's probably these stories that have been told and changed over time, because it's not, I think contact was probably lost with Greenland and Iceland over the years. And people are like, yeah, there's a place out there, but we're not really sure. And then with all the stories being told, you can't really tell what's true or what's not. But yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting, like this folklore is just kind of sitting there, and it's almost, what expires, like if you're a young boy and you want to, what's next is like dreams of far off distant places. Exactly. And I want to be an astronaut maybe today is one of those things. And I want to discover new worlds. And for them back then, it was probably heading out west and finding these mythical places that actually did exist in reality.
It's interesting to think, right? Like that kind of like boyish imagination that's kind of existing in him at this time. So yeah, clearly, his early sailing experience in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Seas, if he did go as far as the British Isles, they were obviously instrumental in shaping him as a mariner and paving the way for, his, historical voyages that we still talk about today. So after those voyages, he's in Portugal. He marries Fyodor of a Portuguese nobleman. They have a son. He continues his career as a maritime trader. He makes several voyages to West Africa, gaining knowledge of the Atlantic winds and the currents that would later, aid his transatlantic voyages. And while he's in Portugal, he begins to develop this plan for a westward voyage to the East Indies. He believed, again, like I said, that the Earth was smaller than generally accepted at the time, and that Asia could be reached by sailing westward from Europe. Apparently, his ideas was based on some sources, including travel accounts, some geographical treatises, and possibly maps of the period.
There's even some stories too. I think the Portuguese look at those maps and they're like, where did you get this from? Where is this math coming from? Like, because we just explained, right? The Portuguese are the cream of the crop when it comes to exploration. They're navigating all the way to India. They know the math, and they're like, yeah, no, we're fine. We've found a way to get to India and a way to get to Asia. Going west there's just a massive ocean there, which if the Americas didn't exist, they don't know that. The math checks out. So it's just funny that, these guys know what they're talking about. And again, I don't know where Columbus is getting his info from, but we'll get into kind of, I guess, a little bit of maybe why he is just believing in some of these things so confidently.
It's interesting, right? Like, so he actually goes to seek support from the Portuguese king, John II. But this is when the king's experts come in. They're extremely skeptical, and they ultimately reject his proposal because none of the evidence that he's providing checks out. And again, to your point, Paul, these are the experts. This is the standard by which you measure maritime navigation expertise and experience. So he moves to Spain in 1485, where he seeks the sponsorship of the Catholic monarchs. So we're talking Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Again, his plan was initially rejected by a commission set up by monarchs to evaluate it. But again, Columbus persisted. And I think this is one of the things that I found really impressive about him was his persistence. This guy had, he was just so persistent in his goal and his belief of what he wanted to do, which I think, from a leadership perspective is quite interesting. Whether it's well-founded or not is a different topic, but right. I think there's something to say about his persistence in achieving this goal.
For sure. And I think one thing to mention too is we definitely see the fanaticism of, he definitely has this itch for exploration and discovering something new. But something I found interesting in the research was he was obsessed with status. He grew up with no status at all. Again, like son of a cheesemaker. Everything he kind of talked about was, I want to get status for my name and for my family. And a lot of the things that he kind of ends up agreeing to is he wants fancy titles. He wants, I can't remember exactly some of the names, but things of like Columbus, Lord of the Sea, sort of stuff like that, because he didn't have any of that. And it's almost weird that was kind of what drove him. It's weird, I guess, when we think of, when we kind of step away from the exploration piece, because we think that's everything, but he was just so obsessed with status. And we'll even see when he makes some of those agreements, there's even things like, oh, my kids must have some level of nobility. He wants to be part of a nobility. So yeah, interesting what makes people tick. And again, the persistence that you were mentioning is there's a little bit of fanaticism, I think, on what he was really looking forward to do. Like he doesn't really have anything else. So I guess that kind of makes sense. But yeah, he just doesn't stop, and he just keeps going until he gets what he wants, which I guess you can respect to a certain extent.
For sure. And I think ego can be a great motivator, but it can also be a great equalizer and detractor of people. So yeah, so if we kind of fast forward a couple years, so he proposes this plan in 1485, kind of quiet for the next couple of years. So in 1492, finally, 7 years later, after the fall of Granada and kind of marked the end of the Reconquista, he finally gets agreement from Queen Isabella to sponsor his voyage. He must have been pumped after all this time. So he's given 3 ships. And this is where we get into kind of the textbook analysis of what we typically hear about Columbus. He's given 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. So he sets sail on August 3rd, 1492. This voyage, during which he actually reached the Americas, marked the beginning of the most famous period of exploration. So the First Voyage, 1492 to 1493. So finally, after several years of lobbying, he secured the support of the Catholic monarchs who fund his village, and they give him the 3 ships. They're prepared in the Andalusian port, and they finally set sail. The expedition set sail on August 3rd, 1492. They first sailed to the Canary Islands belonging to Castile. They restocked, made some minor repairs. From there, they ventured into the open Atlantic heading west. Columbus had hoped that the trade winds would help them on their journey. The journey itself took more than 5 weeks. As the voyage prolonged, the crew became restless, fearful, and they had sailed into what seemed like the unknown. Which, just trying to imagine what that would feel like kind of gives me goosebumps, because they have no idea what they're expecting. And to be able to galvanize a group of men to sail into the abyss, not knowing anything, is so amazing to me.
And even think too, like a 1 degree change in their heading could be the difference of going and only hitting Mexico, or you miss all these Caribbean islands, or changing direction and you find land weeks earlier because you've hit something that's a little bit more east. And there's actually an interesting story during the first voyage. One of, I think it was Columbus's first mate, convinces him that they should change their heading and go slightly more southwest. And if they didn't make that change, they would have actually landed in Florida versus the Caribbean, which again, hey, maybe it would have made the story true. But I think it's just interesting of just a small little change that they made could have rewrote history. So, but again, it's the abyss. Who knows what's there? They didn't know that a slight change to the southwest would have made a difference at all, and made all the difference.
Yeah, it's impressive to think that, a 1% change could have fundamentally rewritten the history book. But yeah, so clearly, they're heading into the abyss, the unknown. I'm sure there's growing discontent amongst the men who feared they would essentially never see land again. So despite these challenges, Columbus convinces them to persist and push forward. So, then we move on to, quote unquote, the discovery of the New World. I always have to use air quotes here. So on October 12th, 1492, 33 days after the westward sail from the Canaries, land was finally sighted. It was an island in the present-day Bahamas. The exact island where Columbus made landfall is kind of unknown, but it's believed it was one of the islands in the Cayman archipelago. Columbus named it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. So he believed at this point that he reached the Indies in Asia, and Columbus referred to the indigenous people as Indians. He was received amicably by the local population, the Lucayan, the Taino, and the Arawak. He continued to explore other islands. His crew explored several other islands in the region, including what's now Cuba, Hispaniola, which is now modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. He established a small colony and named it La Navidad on the northern coast of Hispaniola, and he left 39 men there when he departed. He returned to Spain on January 16th, 1493. Along the way, he encountered several storms. Columbus's ship Santa Maria ran ground and had to be abandoned. And Columbus made the return voyage on the Nina. He arrived back in Palos on March 15th, concluding his first voyage to the New World. He was received as a hero and was recognized by the Spanish monarchs for his achievement. Despite the difficulties in the actual geographical reality of his discovery, Columbus's first voyage marked a significant milestone in human history. Essentially, it formed the initial enduring contact between the old world and the new world.
I think there's just something interesting you were mentioning so Columbus lands in this island, claims it for Spain, but believes he's hit Asia somewhere. And I read somewhere that I think he would say he was either saying he was in China or he was in Japan or he was in India. And I think the first island he thought he was in China, and he basically described that the indigenous population were Chinese. But he claims the island for Spain, which kind of is just the weirdest. Like, isn't that a declaration of war? Essentially, you've rolled into this island.
Yeah.
This is now Spanish. The last thing the Western Catholic world wants to do is to declare war on the Chinese Empire, which is one of the biggest and most powerful in the Eastern world, when you're trying to set up, colonies and small trading posts and stuff. It's just I guess it just kind of goes to his, I don't even know what it is, lack of, or just, I think his commitment to, I'm going to find a way to get to Asia faster. And that's all he cared about. And he didn't think of anything else of, okay, this is for Spain, we're in China. But even if you're in China, what are you doing? Why are you saying this is Spanish? It's just an odd thing to think about.
That's a really good point. Like, do you really want to declare war on one of the world's most formidable empires at the time?
Like, imagine being the Chinese emperor and being like, he did what? Why did he do that?
Well, then Spain thinking like, what did you do? We don't want to go into war with China.
Yeah, I can see some boats being sent out and messengers very quickly being like, don't listen to this guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But one other point that I found interesting, you were mentioning about like just the ship and landing on these islands and setting up the colonies, is Queen Isabella actually didn't let any women go on this voyage, because in her eyes, she's like, these women will just end up being prostitutes, and being the devout Catholic that she is, she doesn't want that to happen. Which we'll get into why, some of the behavior of the men when they land on these islands of stealing indigenous women, because really they had no other options, is big disgusting. But at the same time, what is the alternative, right? This is a bunch of men who are on a ship for 5 weeks. You can either send women with them, or they're going to find a way to find women where they land. And those colonies that are set up, I think one of the interesting pieces is when Columbus comes back, and I'm sure we'll get into the other voyages, is one of the colonies he sets up is everybody's dead, because Columbus sets it up in a terrible position, and these men have just been stealing indigenous women the whole time, and the indigenous communities and men are like, well, we're not going to stand for this. So they've been getting into little conflicts with them, and eventually there's not many of them, so that they're killing off these Spanish settlers very, very quickly. So it's a kind of a mess from day one from a colonization perspective. But again, like you said, coming back, and it's like, you did what? You crossed the Atlantic Ocean and you came back. I think that's even the bigger thing, is you did it twice, and you're able to come back and tell your story is quite huge for the world. And I'm sure it rocked most of the world. And I would like to see what the Portuguese were even thinking too, of did he actually do it? Even though they don't think he did it, where did he actually land? Is this a new place? It would be nice to kind of get inside their heads a little bit as well.
No, some great foreshadowing there, Paul. So jumping into a second voyage, this is often referred to as the Grand Voyage, a much larger expedition than his first, and intended to establish, permanent colonies in the quote unquote New World. So so it's kind of a little bit about the preparation for the voyage. Following the perceived success of the first voyage, he quickly gained approval from Queen Isabella for a second expedition. This time, he was given a much larger fleet consisting of 17 ships. The crew was also much larger, numbering around 1,200 men. It included priests, farmers, soldiers, and, is obviously quite indicative of Spain's intentions to colonize and Christianize the discovered lands. So that expedition set sail from Cadiz, Spain on September 24th, 1493. And unlike the first voyage, Columbus now actually benefited from the trade winds which would carry his fleet across the Atlantic. So after a swift Atlantic crossing, the first land sighted was a small island in the present-day Lesser Antilles on November 3rd, 1493, which Columbus named Dominica. The fleet explored numerous islands of the Caribbean, what's now considered the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. On November 22nd, they arrived back in Hispaniola, where Columbus had left men from the first voyage, only to discover that the fort was destroyed and all the men were dead and presumably killed by the local Taino people. He founded a new settlement on the north coast of Hispaniola named La Isabella after the Spanish queen. It was the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. However, life in the colony proved to be difficult to many of the reasons we often think about colonized life: disease, food shortage, and conflict with the local indigenous population, and it was the Taino. So at this point, Columbus actually left his brother Diego in charge of La Isabella and embarked on a further exploration of the Caribbean. He charted the southern coast of Cuba and explored present-day Jamaica. During this period, he continued to search for the mainland of Asia, still believing that he was close to the continental landmass of the this is when he returns to Spain. So the second voyage proved to be less triumphant than the first. Obviously he's dealing with disease, conflict, and the harsh conditions had taken a toll on the men and the ships. He returns to Spain in 1496, where he had to defend his actions and administration of the colony before the Spanish court. Despite difficulties, the second voyage did still expand European knowledge of the Caribbean and set a precedent for future exploration and colonization. Because
I think you can start to see a little bit of desperation for Columbus on this second voyage, because the Spanish crown wants, you got to find something here. You need to find gold. You need to find spices. You need, because if they thought he could get to Asia, there's a whole bunch of stuff in Asia that they would be able to bring back and trade. So he needs to bring back something, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about, if you can't bring back gold, you can't bring back silk, you can't bring back spices, you can bring back people. You can bring back slaves. We'll get into that in a little bit, I'm sure. But one of the things that I found interesting was how the indigenous tribes would kind of play off Columbus's need for gold and all of these precious gems or whatever it might be, where when he lands in the Bahamas, the local population is like, oh, we were looking for gold. It's not a great place here. We don't have much gold. But if you go a little bit more south, there's another tribe. They've got a lot of gold. And these tribes keep kind of doing that of, there's always there's one tribe over the hill. They've got the gold, and it's kind of a story they keep telling each other. And it's a fantastic defense mechanism by the indigenous population, because you can see clearly what Columbus keeps asking for gold, and he just keeps saying, oh, we don't have any. You should go ask those guys about it. And eventually when the Spanish land in Mexico and meet the Aztecs, and they find out where most of that gold actually is, I just thought that was a kind of a clever little tactic of playing him off for, reading him quite clearly on what he wants, and then sending him on his way.
Well, the pressure's on, right? 17 ships. That is quite the project. And I'm sure it took a, significant chunk of the, coffers of the Spanish Empire at that time, or Spain at that time, sorry, in terms of just funding that massive project.
Definitely. And they just finished a war, right? Kicking out the Muslims out of the south of Spain. So it's not like they're sitting on a pile of gold. They're already very strapped for money, and they're hoping that this is going to be this isn't just, oh, let's see what's out there and we'll lose some money. This is intended to be a profitable venture.
Exactly. Yeah. So we kick back to his third voyage. So his third voyage began in 1498, and this resulted in the discovery of the South American mainland. This was a pretty major milestone in his explorations. Also, it kind of, demarked this beginning of very significant difficulties that Columbus would have to deal with. So in preparation for the voyage, he spends 2 years in Spain following his second voyage, so a bit of a hiatus. He prepares for his third voyage. He struggled to gather support during this time due to kind of these circulating stories of the difficulties and disappointments faced in the colonies. Still not finding gold. There's not that much incentive to fund another voyage. Nevertheless, he was still able to secure 6 ships for that voyage. So he set sail on May 30th, 1498. The fleet was divided into 2 squadrons, 3 ships to go directly to Hispaniola and 3 under Columbus's command to explore more southerly latitudes. Columbus first led his ships to the Portuguese islands of Porto Santo and Madeira, and then sailing south, he reached the Cape Verde Islands, where they resupplied and repaired their ships. Leaving Cape Verde, they sailed westward across the Atlantic, where on July 31st, they sighted an island which Columbus named Trinidad, after the Holy Trinity. Shortly thereafter, Columbus and his men became the first Europeans to sight and explore the South American mainland, which is present-day Venezuela. Here they encountered the mouth of the great river, the Orinoco, which Columbus correctly interpreted as evidence of a continental landmass. So he returns to Hispaniola after this point in time. He leaves the south coast of South America and sets course for Hispaniola, arriving at the colony of Santo Domingo, formerly La Isabella, which had been relocated in August of 1498. What he found was a colony in turmoil. His brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, whom he had left in charge, were not popular with the colonists, and there was an open rebellion against their rule. Conditions in Hispaniola continued to deteriorate, and with Columbus struggling to maintain order, the unrest reached the court in Spain in 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla sent out to Hispaniola to investigate. De Bobadilla arrested Columbus and his brothers, accusing them of poor management, and sent them back to Spain in chains. Though he was released shortly after his arrival in Spain and the charges were dropped, his prestige was ultimately, extremely damaged. The third voyage, as a whole, it did mark a significant turning point in Columbus's fortunes, even though it expanded European knowledge of the New World.
What's crazy about all that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a fourth voyage after this.
There is a fourth voyage, yes.
How
This
on
is the
earth
last one. Yeah.
does he get funding and approval to do a fourth voyage after clearly being mismanaging all of these colonies, not listening to what Queen Isabella wants? Like, even I read something about he brings back some indigenous people as slaves to give to Queen Isabella after she explicitly told him not to do that.
Not to do it. Yeah.
And they came back, and I think half of them died on the voyage. The other half were died off very quickly. And she's furious with him. She's like, what are you doing? Like, this is not how you treat people. Like, she has this very deep Catholic and Christian kind of mentality of, like, care for the poor and the sick. And she's like, I explicitly told you not to do this. And something I found interesting was the culture shock that would have happened to these indigenous people when they got back to Spain. You're living on a small little island in the Bahamas. Could you imagine? So they say many of them died very quickly when they came back. And some people say may have just been a lot of it like mental anguish of what is like looking at what Madrid is and all of these huge cities. It'd be quite the culture shock. But I think one of the indigenous people that comes back ends up joining the church and lives a somewhat normal life. But again, like, he's been arrested. He's completely broken orders. He's mismanaged the colonies to a terrible degree where there's full on mutiny. Yet he still gets a fourth voyage. So I'm curious to kind of hear a bit about how that one goes, because I don't even know how it's possible that it even got, signed off on.
I think it just goes to show and speak to his persistence. He had a goal, he had this grand vision, and he was willing to do pretty much anything to convince people to support him in doing so, which again, we'll get into a little bit when we wrap this up. But yeah, so his fourth and final voyage, I should add, takes place from 1502 to 1504. This journey was primarily focused on finding a westward passage to the Indian Ocean and was marked by a series of disasters. So in preparation for the voyage, despite the controversies of his third voyage, he managed to convince King Ferdinand to sponsor another expedition. This time, however, Columbus was told he could not visit the colonies on Hispaniola due to the issues that had arisen from his previous governorship. His new mission was to find a passage to the Indian Ocean, which he believed was located to the west. So they set sail from the port of Cadiz on May 9th, 1502. His crew consisted of approximately 150 men. The fleet landed on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. From there, they sailed to Hispaniola, where Columbus sought shelter to prepare for hurricane season. However, Columbus and his fleet were denied entry due to the previous problems with the colony's administration, and they were forced to sail on. His fleet was then caught in a storm, but they somehow managed to survive. So from that, after surviving the storm, he's able to explore several locations across the coast of Central America, which includes modern-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. And he continues to search for a straight or narrow passage to the Indian Ocean. In 1503, while exploring the coast of Panama, the expedition encounters hostile indigenous people and adverse weather conditions. Damaging the ships, Columbus is forced to beach his remaining vessels on the north coast of Jamaica, where they become stranded. While stranded, Columbus and his men face, obviously many hardships. They're in conflicts with the local indigenous population. They probably have little to no food at this time. Morale, I assume, is more or less non-existent, and they have to try to keep these hostile indigenous groups at bay. So there's a story about Columbus using his knowledge of the forthcoming lunar eclipse, which he presented as this kind of divine sign of displeasure of God having with the indigenous groups. And he was able to trick them into actually providing food and shelter and kind of, keeping them at bay, because he was able to use his knowledge of the almanac and the upcoming lunar eclipse to kind of, take advantage and exploit the lack of knowledge that the indigenous groups had at that time. So two of Columbus's men after this point, Diego Mendez and Bartolomeu Fischi, made a daring canoe journey to Hispaniola to seek a ship and help. So after a delay due to political issues in Hispaniola, a relief mission was eventually dispatched. Columbus and his men are rescued in June of 1504, and they returned to Spain later that year. So this essentially marks the end of Columbus's final voyage to America. He returns to Spain in a state of poor health and disillusionment. He's having issues with his eye. Historians think he's having some mental health issues. He's failed ultimately to find a westward passage to Asia or restore his reputation in the colonies. He actually passes away 2 years later in 1506, still believing that he had found a western route to the Indies. Like, he was convinced that he had landed in Asia, and he was trying to find a continued path to India.
Just wouldn't give it up, would he? It's funny. And you were saying in the mental state piece, I remember reading something about in those last voyages, he would spend hours up, and I think it's the crow's nest, the thing that's kind of at the top of the mast where they kind of use to look out a little bit farther. He's up there for hours just talking to God. So again, not uncommon for the time to, be very devoted to religion and spend a lot of time in solitude. But to do that on a ship when you're the captain, there's definitely some questions to be asked about where his mental state was at. So yeah, it's just crazy that he wouldn't give up the fact that he thought he was in Asia or he was in India or wherever he thought he was.
Or Malaysia, apparently.
Yeah, Malaysia.
He was just adamant that, I think in the later voyages that he thought he landed in Malaysia, which is so interesting to think that someone who is obviously a skilled cartographer and navigational seafaring expert is he is denying reality in so many ways, which really just, it's always difficult to kind of have that dichotomy and make sense of it. Someone who's so skillful, so talented, obviously has a great understanding of seafaring and navigation, who, when presented with this reality that he's actually not in Asia, still is adamant that he is in Asia and continues to do so for 4 voyages.
It's crazy because he knows these places exist. They know something about what Japanese and Chinese people look and sound like and what languages they speak and how their language is written. He sees none of that. He sees completely different looking people speaking a completely different language, and he just won't give it up. And I think there's definitely this level of fanaticism of, I want to be right. I want to have my legacy, but he doesn't realize that his legacy is already built. I think you've discovered something that nobody even knew existed. I would almost surprise that he didn't go the other way and be like, actually, I've discovered something brand new and it is here for Spain. If he was able to do that, I think more people would kind of have been okay, I think, with a little bit of his antics and stuff. But I guess I'm thinking kind of a recap on him. He's clearly a very good speaker and very good at convincing people. Persistence is obviously important, but he's very persuasive, clearly, to be able to convince. Again, that 4th voyage, I don't know how he did it. I would love to know.
It's insane.
Love to hear what that conversation.
Sent back in chains.
A criminal.
Sent back in chains to somehow convince the king to fund one last go at this to find India.
Insane. Yeah. So he has that. He's clearly incredibly brave to be able to just go out into the open ocean and see where he ends up. So I think there's definitely some qualities of persistence, determination, bravery, and just putting everything he has into his mission. But he's a very, very poor executor, I think, in terms of, I wouldn't say he's a poor executor altogether. He's very clearly a good navigator and very good, leading men, at least on a ship. But when it comes to administration, colonization, being able to set up something long-standing, definitely not his area of expertise.
No, it's interesting too, right? Like, the more we've talked about this, and it's always fun in these conversations because we're learning as we're going along from each other, and there's this kind of Joan of Arc-esque sentiment.
Yeah, there is
kind of coming to light for me here. Obviously, there's the religious undertones. He is a devout Catholic, and we're gonna double underline devout here.
Yes.
He often referred to himself as the Christ bearer, right? I think when you have this kind of fanatic religious belief, which, I think is true of Joan of Arc, and when we kind of do that comparison, and, if you are a decent orator and you're persistent and you truly believe in what you're trying to accomplish, regardless of the actual, reality you might be trying to contend with, like he was, you can convince people.
Oh yeah.
Right. And this is a Catholic, monarch that he's talking to. So it's quite interesting to do that comparison. It wasn't necessarily something that came to mind early in the analysis, but as we've talked more about it, I'm seeing some very interesting similarities.
For sure. And I think know your audience is kind of the key 100%. Takeaway here. Joan of Arc knew her audience. They knew that everybody there is deeply religious, and same with Christopher Columbus. I don't think it was something they consciously thought about of, oh, I need to put a religious spin on this. I think it just came from somewhere deep within them that they were so religious, everyone else was so religious, and it kind of came together. But yeah, just thinking a bit too on what we kind of talked about at the beginning of, I guess, decision points for him. We have the inability to give up where he is. I think we've kind of talked about it a little bit already. Then also kind of the treatment of the indigenous population. So I think one thing I'd read kind of recently, and I think this is maybe some revisionist history and kind of more new age things, is people saying Columbus was genocidal and was there to kind of destroy the indigenous population. I don't think we see any evidence of that intentionally. We know how everything ends up for the indigenous populations in later years, but I don't think Columbus ever really had that goal in mind. It was definitely of discovery and being able to create these colonies, and just horrendous administration and not being really good at public relations and working with these indigenous tribes to make sure that these areas could actually thrive. Turned into a lot of conflict and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of terrible things happening. And then just taking back slaves when he's told not to is, I get definitely the sentiment of his relationship was more cruel, I think, than it needed to be, especially because it's not necessarily like he showed up and he was attacked right away. There's conversations going on and they're at least trying to communicate. So yeah, I think it definitely, I wouldn't say it's on the genocidal maniac sort of side. I just think it's a lot of incompetence that led to more violence and bloodshed and terrible outcomes than really needed to be.
Yeah, I don't think genocidal is an apt description or like objective that he set out with. I think he was pretty singular minded in his goal, so singular minded that like everything else kind of fell apart. I don't know if there was a clear discussion or conversation between him and Queen Isabella. It was who's actually going to manage these colonies when you get there, but I don't think he ever figured it was going to be him that was ultimately going to be responsible. Yeah, from that decision point, it's an interesting one. Like his treatment of the indigenized, it's brutal still based on what we've talked about today. I think it's definitely that exploitive nature, in this era, which it's kind of part and parcel with what he's going on before. So, I always kind of go back to this idea of like he, in some ways, was very much a product of his.
Yeah, I think he's a product of his time, but he also didn't listen. I think that's the thing. Like, I think Queen Isabella is trying to do something a little bit different here. She's against royal subjects is a big thing for her, and stealing the women and killing the men is not really what she had in mind, and lets them have it for that. So I think, it's definitely a product of his time, but I think things are changing a little bit. And I think if he had a little bit more of that charisma on, I guess, relationships with these people and not just being so fanatical on what he was trying to do, and maybe just a bit more competent in that side of his life, I think it wouldn't have ended the way it did. And I don't know if it would have been the same if somebody else had done that voyage. Having said that, I can't guarantee that someone who would have been better at administration and working with the local population would have even got there, because Columbus is clearly a brilliant navigator, maybe one of the best the world has ever seen. So yeah, I think it's kind of two sides of the same coin, and to get both kind of brilliant navigator, brilliant administrator, maybe didn't exist at that time. Yeah. And the bravery too. Maybe there are people that are doing that. And the Portuguese clearly have people who have the ability to sail all the way around Africa and set up colonies that actually are able to trade and have good relationships and build a network. But those guys aren't just driving off or sailing off west into the Atlantic Ocean to just see what happens. They're making so much money doing the rest of what they were doing. So I think it does take, maybe a more desperate man to kind of set off on these great voyages and do something that no one had ever thought was even possible.
Yeah, I agree. He definitely had a grand vision and a grand goal. And, there's that religious underpinning, and it's so hard to even like articulate in a reasonable way. But I think when you have like this grand idea and then you have intertwined it with this kind of, manifest destiny, which I know I'm stealing a word from that's often used with like, American expansionism, but like you kind of get that sentiment though, right? Like, we're going to expand, we're going to move westward, we're going to discover the new world, and we're going to be this great Christianizing mission. There's a lot of these kind of ideas that are probably like, bubbling away in his mind, kind of coming up with this grand vision of how he sees himself as this amazing explorer that's going to, discover this new world in the name of Columbus, but also in the name of Catholicism.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I'm walking away from this with a very, very different view of Columbus. And I think one thing I even noticed was when people of the same time period are judging you negatively and saying, he's actually a little nuts. he's not someone we want to work with. He doesn't really know what he's doing when it comes to administration and all of these sort of things. And he was having trouble finding people because his reputation was so poor. I think that's a fair way to judge Columbus.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, we can look back and use our 21st century goggles and kind of make a judgment. But with the people in the 15th and 16th century saying a lot of the same things we're saying in terms of, you know, he's a little crazy and a little not great to work with and not someone you'd want to get on a ship for 30 plus days and see what happens. I think it's fair to kind of criticize him there, but also just say, wow, what a brave person. And again, who knows if that would have even happened or how much longer it would have taken for the New World to be discovered if someone like Columbus wasn't around. So just an interesting kind of thought experiment.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. I think we can wrap up there, Ritchie, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.